Hello, I'm Moses Bratchard. You are joining the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council. I'm so glad you're here with us, and I am here with our very special guest, Becca Delahunt, the Director of Public Policy for Minnesota Family Council. Frog in my throat there. We're so glad to have Becca here.
Thank you.
Missing our co-host Grace this week, but Becca is going to talk about some of the things that she does at the Capitol and throughout the state as she leads our lobbying efforts and many other things that she does. So that'll be coming up right after this. So, Becca, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Happy Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone watching.
And happy Lent.
And happy Lent. This is coming out after these days, I guess.
Right.
Did I speak out of turn?
No, that's good. Yeah, we're filming on Wednesday the 14th.
I'm new to this.
And this is coming to you guys on Friday the 16th. That's how we do things. And that's not a secret. But Becca, I'm so glad that you're here. And I think that we're going to have you here several more times throughout the legislative session, if you're open to doing that, because obviously during the session, talking about pending bills is one of the biggest things that we can do to inform Minnesotans about what's going on, because Minnesota Family Council's core values, life, family, religious freedom. And every year there are bills that either advance those values or potentially threaten those values. And so, Becca, can you tell us a little bit about this session? What does it mean that we're in the second year of the biennium? What does that mean? And what are the legislators mostly going to be focusing on?
Yes. Yeah, well, Minnesota operates on a 2-year cycle called a biennium. And the first year of that cycle is more focused on the budget and spending. And the second year is focused on what they call bonding. So the state issuing bonds for construction projects. And so that's going to be the focus as we head into the election. And obviously members will be getting ready to campaign for their reelection efforts if they're running again. We do have a lot of members retiring, actually, Moses. We haven't talked about that. But yeah, members will be focusing on what they call bonding, but that doesn't mean that they will not be also running policies that we are concerned about, that we're watching, and that we're lobbying against.
Sure. So this year they're focusing on bonding for construction, which sounds a little bit boring.
Yeah.
And so maybe in theory, people are going to be paying less attention.
Yeah.
So, but you're saying that's not going to keep legislators from definitely focusing on some controversial issues.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've heard about a number of controversial issues. I'm sure we're going to get into them today, but those policy issues still come up even when it's not a budget year.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So getting right into those issues, we talked last week about the ERA, and Grace and I talked about how the language has been completely changed since the ERA was initially introduced so many years ago, and how it's really not about equal rights anymore. I mean, and it's not about equality between the sexes anymore. It really has moved on. But you're focusing on this issue so much more closely. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the ERA and other bills of concern this year. And also there was a rally this week on Monday, the first day of session. So can you tell us about that?
Yes, absolutely. Well, it sounds like you talked already a bit about the Equal Rights Amendment, but the Equal Rights Amendment is really a concern to us at Minnesota Family Council for a variety of reasons. I think Moses went through the language last week, but it affects basically all of the issues we work on. So when it comes to gender, so-called gender affirming care and its impacts on children, and parental protection of children impacts that. The updated language explicitly includes protections for abortion up to the moment of birth. And you might be saying, don't we already have that in Minnesota? Well, yes, we do, but it's only in statutory protection, which could change depending upon, what majority is in power and if they want to change that. Something that maybe you didn't touch on last week that I think is worth noting is the religious freedom aspects. So with the updated language, they took out any reference to protections for religious freedom. I think the original language said creed, protected the right of every individual to practice their own creed, which would function, I guess, as a sort of religious freedom protection. Even that would have had to be ironed out. But the updated language has no explicit protection for religious beliefs or creed And that is highly
Wow.
concerning. Yeah.
That's something I think to drill down on,
Yeah.
because you had version of this bill, I don't know if this was the version last year or in previous years,
Mhm.
that explicitly stated, and we the Minnesota Constitution does already guarantee religious freedom, as the US Constitution does, but it's always good, in
Mhm.
my view, for those things to be strengthened.
Yeah.
Not that the ERA would have been a good bill, even if it had that language, okay, to be
Mhm.
clear. But it's certainly better to say, no, we're having this equal rights amendment, and equal
Mhm.
rights applies to people with religious faith. And I
Mhm.
can see how that would have been helpful, for example, during the COVID-19
Yeah.
vaccine battles, about where people with deeply held religious beliefs were being forced to take those vaccines against their will or lose their jobs, or not be allowed to come to school. Just such a crazy environment. And thankfully, well, I wouldn't say we're past that stage where the federal government is, or the state government wants to force people to take vaccines, because we're not past that stage. But at least we're past that stage with the COVID-19 pandemic. However, I think it's just so illustrative what they would take out and what they would put
Mhm.
in. So they take
Mhm.
out protections for religious freedom,
Yeah.
and they put in protections for so-called gender affirming care, as you talked about,
Mhm.
and abortion, as you
Abortion,
said.
gender. Yeah.
It's,
And
where are people's priorities?
where are the priorities? And admittedly, I think we're wondering what would the impact be. I mean, we have the right to practice our religious freedom and religious expression from our First Amendment constitutional rights. And so, how would that come into conflict if that is not explicitly protected in this constitutional amendment? I think that remains to be seen. And those questions need to be asked by the lawmakers who are proposing this. And, hopefully that will happen eventually in debate on the floor. But it's just noteworthy that they're prioritizing the right of people to express their own so-called gender and gender identity, abortion, and they're excluding the right to practice any sort of creed in using the original language form or religious freedom.
I think people need to make sure that your pastor and your church fellows know about this bill.
Yeah.
Like we know, I'll ask you a little bit more about that rally in a second, but
Yeah.
I think we know that this is a priority for legislators,
Mhm.
and we think that that this is something that they're actually serious about.
Mhm.
It's not just one of those things that gets introduced and then nothing happens about it. At least
Yeah.
as far as we know.
Yeah.
But tell your pastor that there's a bill that used to have protections for religious freedom, but they removed that and they added gender and abortion instead. I just think that is so. We've said that now, I think, 3 times, so I don't want to belabor the point too much. But don't you think, folks in the audience, don't you think that that's something people need to know about? And yet, if you ask people, did you know that there is a potential constitutional amendment that would do this? Most people don't. I would imagine 70 to 90% of people have no idea that that is coming. And that is really concerning. So I wonder, from that rally on Monday, which you were there, kind of snuck in, tell us about your thoughts about the rally. And did you learn anything from the speakers about this bill and about possibly the timeline for this bill?
For sure. Yeah. I wanted to make a brief comment too about the difference between this process. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. This is different than a statutory change, just so everyone's aware. Both chambers have to pass this, similar to just a normal bill process. But then this would be put forth to voters in an election year. And so that could be this year, it could be 2026. Speaker Hortman has made it sound like it'll be 2026. Potentially that could change. But this ends up being a really long battle should this change our Constitution, because it's not as simple as changing it through our statutes. I would assume, Moses, that we would have to do another amendment process to reverse that. And that can take a long time. So as far as what I learned this week, well, they had a big rally on Monday with a lot of allied organizations coming out in full support of the ERA. It's worth noting, Moses, that it has passed the Senate. Usually things pass the House first and then they move to the Senate. But this has passed the Senate. It had bipartisan support. It was 43 to 23. And now it's set to go into debate on the House floor. And the House author said that they're planning to get this done before the end of the month.
Wow.
And so we're lobbying against it and we're equipping members to be able to speak against that. and trying to educate everybody on what this means. And if this comes up in 2024 or in 2026 to vote no, I would say that's the biggest thing that I learned from Monday. But also it was interesting to see all the people who they got to come out to speak in favor of this. They actually had Keith Ellison, our Attorney General, come and speak in favor of this. They also had Congresswoman Betty McCollum come speak.
My Congresswoman, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, Betty McCollum spoke in favor. They had some religious leaders come speak in favor. I believe there was a Presbyterian minister and also someone from the Unitarian Society of Minneapolis.
Yeah, that's not a religious leader.
Yeah.
Unitarians are people who get together on Sundays and have coffee and talk about what they don't know about God.
Cultural things. Well, yeah, so they all spoke in favor of this. Also worth noting, Moses, there were a lot of males there who are really excited to have the utmost rights to enter previously sex-segregated spaces and facilities and women's-only athletic teams, prison facilities, etc. And it was very interesting to hear lots of people get up and talk about women's rights and how women need to have these protections. And then you have males get up and say, and we're so excited to be included because we also identify as women and we want to have the utmost right to women's spaces. So
that's so scary in a sense. Yeah. And, it's also kind of funny. I mean, let's be real, but it is a little bit, I think it indicates the power that this community has, these men who identify as women and women who identify as men, but they're driving the agenda to an extent. Like, why is the ERA not just about protecting women anymore? In fact, it's arguably not about that at all anymore.
Absolutely.
It's about gender and it's about abortion. And like, as far like the new language includes abortion.
It does.
The language last year only included gender. Am I right?
It did. Yes, it did include the word sex, and sex has been taken in other instances to include abortion, but this is more explicit protections. Sure. And I do want to say, and if you have children present, please pause this. I do want to say, I kind of made light of that fact, but this is really serious. I don't know if our listeners are familiar with the fact that there is a male currently housed in Shakopee Women's Prison. And last I heard, as of fall 2023, he's fully intact and he's housed with women. I don't believe that our children housed at Shakopee Women's Prison. I don't think so, but I'm hearing reports across the world about males being housed in women's prisons, and sometimes those women's prisons include families, so children as well.
Good grief.
Yeah.
I think our annual dinner speaker, Seth Dillon, and we're really excited about that event, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but he has a clip talking about, a woman got pregnant at a women's prison, and it turned out that her cellmate was a man who identified as a woman. And people are sort of like, how did this happen?
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, well, it's pretty clear how this happened. Mm-hmm. It's the basic biological reality that is the reason we're all here, actually, which is in itself not a bad thing, but not what you want in a women's prison.
No.
That's not what you want.
It's cruel and unusual punishment, and these women are being forgotten.
Yeah, it's
Nobody's
rape.
advocating for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that is, as you've said, probably our biggest, it's the E on the eye chart, the ERA on the eye chart, the bill that we're most concerned about this year. But there are others. So can you tell us a little bit about those?
Absolutely. Well, another one that we're tracking really closely is the so-called Gender Affirming Rights Act. And last year at the end of session, the Queer Caucus named this as one of their priorities for passage in 2024. And this will sound probably similar to what Moses and Grace shared with you last week about the ERA, because the implications as far as so-called gender affirming care go are very similar to the implications that would happen if the ERA should pass. And so the language states that every individual in Minnesota has a right to determine their own gender and related gender affirming care. And you'll notice that there is no specification on age in that bill. And so this would mean that children have the so-called right to determine their own gender affirming care. And Moses, I just want to note that this is highly concerning. Generally speaking, the vast majority of times, children are safest with their parents' protection. And if we say that the medical industrial complex has the right to come in and engage with our children, and they are better at protecting children than the child's own biological parents, or adoptive parents or guardian who's been with that child from the beginning. That's simply not true. They don't have that child's best interest in mind relative to the child's parents. And to just make that blanket statement that children have the so-called right to gender-affirming care is really a wolf in sheep's clothing, because it's exposing children to be abused by an industry that is making money from having that direct contact with those children. And so I think it's extremely naive for lawmakers to say, yes, this is in children's best interest to remove parents from the equation. That's not safe for children, and that's not what we want for Minnesota.
Absolutely not. And I'm so grateful to you for bringing that specificity of that bill to us, because I don't think we've talked about that particular bill on the podcast. As you said, similar to, but not identical to bills that we have discussed, like the kidnapping bill last year.
Sure. Yeah.
So
can I add one more note that I forgot about that? I was talking to a friend about that bill, and she said, what's interesting is, yes, according to this language, every individual has the right to so-called gender-affirming care, but there's no note about detransitioners. And we know from so many detransitioners that they're having a hard time finding any health care, and their insurance is dropping them because practitioners aren't educated on how to care for them, and their needs are so vast because the symptoms from taking cross-sex hormones or puberty blockers are broad, and they're really terrible for people's health on a number of levels. And so there's no protections for detransitioners within that bill. And that's highly concerning because a lot of them just aren't getting access to healthcare, and they're in a lot of pain. Osteoporosis, struggling with heart issues. I mean, you name it, depending upon what procedures or what medication they've been exposed to. So it's very cavalier and open-ended, and it needs a lot of discussion when it reaches committee and should it reach the floor for a vote.
Speaking of medical risks for vulnerable people, we've talked about physician-assisted suicide several times over the years on this podcast, including last week, to note that there was a hearing on it even before the session started. Can you tell us more about your concerns about that legislation, and where do you see people sort of landing on that issue?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, physician-assisted suicide is, first of all, it's a really sad issue on so many levels. It allows an individual to be prescribed lethal drugs when that individual's received a 6-month life expectancy. And so I just want to say at the outset that we understand that when an individual is faced with that scenario, that's a really tough situation, and they're faced with a lot of decisions. And so I just want to lay that groundwork and just say that we understand this is a really touchy issue. As far as the policy issue itself, Moses, this is an issue where a lot of outstate money comes into states. They kind of dive bomb in, and they start a lot of grassroots activism within states. And so this is something that we see, year after year. And the way this particular policy is written, it does require 2 providers to say that this individual seeking the lethal drugs can receive them, but it doesn't actually require a physician to prescribe the lethal drugs. And I think it's worth noting, Moses, that when a person is seeking hospice, which is also based on a similar 6-month prognosis, a nurse practitioner cannot qualify patients for hospice. And so this is much more of a drastic choice, obviously, taking lethal drugs. And this allows nurse practitioners to prescribe that. Whereas, for hospice care, a nurse practitioner cannot do that.
That makes sense to me, because ultimately this is, of course, it's not healthcare. It's just not. It's the opposite of that. But it's also like fundamentally driven by ideology and a lack of compassion and respect for the dignity of human life, as opposed to a desire to actually help people who are in severe pain.
Absolutely. Well, and people should know that we have, and I don't want to minimize anybody's pain, but people should know we have a lot of options when it comes to managing end-of-life care. We have palliative care, hospice care. We have end-of-life directives in Minnesota. And so there are ways to go about that. Moses, I think one thing that's really worth noting with this legislation is that it does not require the individual seeking the lethal drugs to be a Minnesota resident or citizen. And so there's been some talk about how Minnesota is already, and I hate using these words because it sounds so cavalier, but an abortion tourism state or a quote unquote gender affirming care tourism state. And if something like this were to pass, it would make Minnesota a physician-assisted suicide tourism state. Or it could, just based on the language.
Right.
And I think it's also, just thinking about the implications of this, an individual who's seeking this wouldn't really need to have a relationship with the providers prescribing this, or at least the provider prescribing the drugs, if they're not even in the same state. There's no reason to think that there would need to be a prior relationship. And so I think when you dive, it's a really difficult and sad issue. When you dive a little bit deeper, you see this is driven by money, I think a lot, on the part of healthcare industry. And we have the best healthcare in Minnesota. I mean, we have amazing healthcare and healthcare research in Minnesota. And so it seems like we should be coming up with better creative policy solutions. And I think we could. And yet we're trying to go to something that is not healthcare. I mean, you'd have to be naive to say this won't lead to rationing of healthcare and deciding who is fit to receive healthcare and who is not fit and should be, recommended to take these lethal drugs.
Right.
I think you'd have to be extremely naive to not see that connection because healthcare is expensive.
Absolutely. And it's the last year of a person's life when they accrue I think a majority of like all of the medical expenses that they're going to have throughout their entire life is in that last year of life. And so people are looking for ways to cut costs. As you said, healthcare is expensive, but can we do that without taking away the dignity of every human life without, we're against suicide. We're for suicide prevention. But then our opponents on this issue say, we're for suicide prevention. Unless someone's really, really sick and ill. In that case, they can do what they want. And we'll look the other way. Or actually, we'll give them the fatal pills. And it's like, that's a problem. That's a branding problem for them. And it's just a huge moral problem for us.
Yeah. I think it's an opportunity for the church to step in, make sure that we are meeting with these people who are at the end of life. A lot of the people who are testifying in favor, they need relationship. They need people to care for them and to help them make decisions on how to manage end of life care. Because I don't want to minimize, that is really difficult. And we have friends going through that right now. So we just need to do a better job of taking care of our people at the end of life.
Yes.
And this doesn't encourage a good culture to do that.
Absolutely not. So, Becca, you've talked about 3 bills that are critical, we think, to that people need to be watching the session, and there may be more. What can people do that we're introducing this week to stay informed about these bills?
Absolutely. Well, I'm really excited to share that we're going to be introducing a very easy-to-use bill tracker on our website. I think Moses will have the link available, but I just want you to have a one-stop shop to be aware of the bills that are coming up and where they're at in the political process. Moses does a great job of updating you if you sign up for our regular emails on things that are coming up, but you might want to have something in one location where you can find where all of these bills are that we've been tracking over session. And so I want it to be a simple to use bill tracker.
Yes.
And we're really looking forward to having that live later this week.
So that will be live by the time you're watching this at mfc.org/bill tracker. That simple, that easy. The bills Becca has talked about today will be on there. And as we move into session, I think it's fair to say there may be a couple more added. And certainly we'll update that page as we have hearings on various bills and votes and so forth. Yeah. And so, as you said, a place where people can get that information just in one place. People have asked us for this for years. And it's been something that has been it hasn't really been that hard to put together, but other things have crowded it out. But now we're bringing that out, and I really hope that it will be useful. Yeah. So, folks, I'm really glad Becca's here. And before we close, I want to talk about our annual dinner. It's coming up on April 26th. That gets closer every week, actually. And so far, we've told you that you can pre-register now, and you can be the first to receive tickets. Now, I should tell you that registration is going to open soon, and we have had, I think, 4 times as many people pre-register this year as registered last year.
Wow.
We're looking at a decent proportion of all the tickets that are going to be available are actually already spoken for. So I really recommend right now, go to mfc.org/dinner2024, pre-register now. You will get, as far as I know, registration will open up next week. There'll be a lot of demand. If you pre-register now, you'll get a link to register before general registration opens. So do that. Again, it's with Seth Dillon, the CEO of the Babylon Bee. Our theme is Rulers Rage, God Laughs. And now we'll close with our kind of our fun thing where we talk about what we're reading, and then we'll do our, as Becca probably remembers, we always close with a verse from God's Word. So we'll do that to close out our episode. Becca, what are you reading right now?
Yeah, well, I was just chatting with Moses. I'm actually auditing a historical theology class with Bethlehem College and Seminary. They did not pay me to say that, but I thought I would say that, so my reading's kind of all over the place. Right now, I've been reading excerpts from The Freedom of the Christian by Martin Luther, and it's been very encouraging.
Based.
Yeah, it's been really encouraging. But I've also been reading Amazing Grace by Eric Metaxas about William Wilberforce. And I love that.
Yes.
That's made me so emotional and very encouraged in my work.
I'm sure you've seen the movie.
Yes.
Yeah, that is one of my favorite. I got to watch that again. A young Benedict Cumberbatch.
I know.
Playing kind of an old, dying prime minister, which is a funny role for him. It's because he has kind of that face that already looks old.
Yeah.
Not saying he's
But they have him when he's young, too. They have him when he's like 24, 25. And then he does.
And then he's
away.
Dying. And great movie, though. He plays William Pitts the Younger, I think.
Yes.
Prime Minister.
Pitt the Younger. What are you reading, Moses?
I am reading kind of some books that are not super educational.
Academic?
I'm reading
books to your children?
So many books to my children, always. I could spend a whole episode on that. But actually just finishing up The Hobbit, reading The Hobbit to Mary.
That's wonderful.
She's kind of losing interest now that the goblins are not involved, although she doesn't know the goblins are going to come back for the Battle of the Five Armies. But she loved when the hobbits were captured, the Hobbit and the dwarves were captured by the goblins.
Oh, that's not a good part. That's not a good part.
She just loves being scared. She loves it. And
wow.
She's watched the animated Hobbit where they go down to Goblin Town. Below my lad. I'm gonna have to play her this clip because she loves that song. She was singing at 3:30 a.m. this morning.
Wow. Oh, lovely.
Yeah. She went back to sleep after that. So I'm reading a sci-fi book, which is kind of I'm embarrassed about. I won't even tell you. But I'm also reading a murder mystery book called The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle.
Oh.
And this is for my book group. Not a book that I would have chosen for myself.
Okay.
But it's kind of interesting because it's like a murder mystery, but it's also like time traveling multiverse type of thing.
Yeah.
Again, not a book I would have chosen for myself.
Yeah, I need to know what a half death is. I'm trying to.
No, I will let you know if I ever figure that out.
Okay.
But I have to say, the first 50, 60 pages, I was like, this is trash. Why am I reading this?
He was going through a half death.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I was like, I'm literally aging as I read this.
Yeah.
Actually that's literally true.
Yeah.
But now I'm halfway through and I'm like, okay, what's next? It really drew me in after a while. I probably wouldn't have persevered except for the book club thing. So I'm glad of that.
We need that.
Right. So now let's close. Let's close now with a verse from God's Word from Habakkuk this week. Habakkuk 2:14. Last week we had Jeff Evans in the studio, and this was not a podcast episode, but that's our CEO, and we were talking with him about the annual dinner. And what I love about Jeff, among many other things, is that he never loses sight of the gospel. When the political trenches, sometimes we have the temptation to lose hope. Jeff never loses hope about the political scheme. People ask us, is there hope for Minnesota? Can we actually make change? Jeff says, yeah, we can always make change because God is in charge. We're not in charge. Our enemies are not in charge. God is in charge. And so I saw this verse from Habakkuk, and it just really reminded me of Jeff and what he said, and which we're releasing in short clips to you guys as he talks about the annual dinner and the vision we have for that. Habakkuk 2:14. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So that's like this future promise that we don't see yet, but we're starting to see. There are more Christians alive now than there ever have been in the history of the world, right? places that were not Christian previously, like in Southeast Asia or in Africa, are now full of hundreds of millions of Christians. And well, it seems like we see that our faith in decline in this country, and that's sad to see. We also at this hopefully see a rebirth of true faith in this country and in countries around the world, and we can trust in God's promises that that sort of this. I see this as sort of like what do you call it? A fulfillment of the type of Noah. So the flood, Noah's flood, filled the earth with God's judgment. But Habakkuk talks about the knowledge of the glory of the Lord covering the earth as the waters cover the sea. And I just think that's a beautiful image of sort of the eschaton, the Christian vision of the future that we have as believers, that anybody can join us and be part of. And it's as easy as being baptized and believing in Jesus, who redeemed us and who saves us. So that's my last word for you guys. And I'm so thankful, Becca, that you're here today. And thank you to everyone who's watching or listening to the Family Beacon podcast this week. We will be back with you next week so that you can get the facts and stand for truth.